The Butler's Ledger. Miss Jane Marple sat by the dying fire in the quiet guest bedroom at Ashgrove Hall, holding a small, black, leather-bound book that had belonged to a dead man. The man was Cornelius Whitmore, a butler of such immaculate, unquestioned, and invisible service for 40 years that he had become less a servant and more a structural, load-bearing pillar of the great house, right until the final week of his life, when he had been branded a common, desperate thief. He had died within days of that sudden accusation, tumbling down the steep cellar stairs in what was officially called a drunken, despairing fall, leaving behind a confession that everyone in the household believed but which Miss Marple knew, with absolute certainty, had been written by someone else's hand entirely. The real story, the only one that truly mattered, was not going to be told by a local policeman or a private detective or a tearful, guilty relative, but by the dead man himself, in the meticulous, undeviating handwriting of the diary she now held. The only question was whether she could read fast enough to catch a murderer before the ink on the final page dried forever. Hello friends, I'm Jack, coming to you from right here in Ohio, and welcome back to Midnight Pages. Tonight's story is a peculiar one, an exercise in memory, meticulousness, and misdirection, and a reminder that the quietest people in the room are very often the ones who hear the absolute most. If you've ever kept a secret just by staying silent, and I know some of you have, drop a line in the comments and let me know. Now, settle in, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let me take you to Ashgrove Hall. Chapter 1: The Man Who Kept the Keys. It was late October when the request came, arriving at Miss Marple's modest cottage in St. Mary Mead not by the usual channels of telephone or telegram, but by a heavy, cream-laid envelope brought by a private, uniformed driver. The handwriting on the front was sweeping, arrogant, and highly agitated, belonging to Lady Eleanor Ashgrove, a woman who possessed a great deal of generational wealth and very little patience for the inconveniences of mortality. Miss Marple had met Eleanor Ashgrove only twice, on committee boards for the preservation of historic parishes in the county, but she knew the type perfectly well. There was a woman in St. Mary Mead, a Mrs. Bantry, who handled sudden grief by organizing it into subcommittees and actionable items, and Eleanor Ashgrove was cast from the exact same rigid mold. When Miss Marple arrived at the imposing, limestone-fronted expanse of Ashgrove Hall in Berkshire the following afternoon, she found the great house draped not in solemn mourning, but in an atmosphere of suppressed, irritable, and highly embarrassing scandal. "It is the sheer indignity of it all," Eleanor said, pacing the length of the sunlit morning room. She was a tall woman in her early 60s, dressed in severe, expensive tweeds, smoking a cigarette with sharp, stabbing motions that left plumes of smoke lingering in the air. 40 years, Miss Marple. 40 years of trust. He came to this house when my husband, Sir Horace, was still alive, before the children were even born. He knew the combinations to the silver safes. He knew where the family silver was buried in the gardens during the war. He knew absolutely everything. And then to find out he was siphoning the accounts dry, stealing from the very family that fed him, and to have him die before we could even dismiss him properly, it is intolerable. It is a violation. Miss Marple sat in a chintz armchair near the roaring fire, her knitting needles resting quietly in her lap, and looked into the flames. "It must have been a terrible shock," she said, her voice mild, fluffy, and entirely accommodating, revealing absolutely nothing of her sharp mind. "To lose someone so suddenly. And the stairs to the wine cellar are terribly steep, I am told." Slippery, too, in the damp. He was drunk, said a new, slurred voice from the doorway. It was Richard Ashgrove, the eldest son, who had inherited his father's vast estate but none of his father's commanding presence or business acumen. He slouched against the heavy oak doorframe, a crystal glass of whiskey already in his hand despite the early hour of the afternoon. He'd been at the brandy. Guilt, I suppose. The police said he must have missed a step in the dark. Broke his neck instantly. Good riddance, frankly. And the confession? Miss Marple asked gently, picking up a stitch. Found on his desk in the pantry, Richard said, taking a swallow and wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Just a few lines. I cannot bear the shame of what I have done. The estate accounts are my doing. Typed, of course. He always used the old Underwood typewriter for the household menus. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes flickered. Typed, she repeated softly. She thought of Mr. Cleary, the postmaster back home, who had once tried to forge a typed letter of recommendation for his wayward nephew, entirely forgetting that a man who has written in a precise, copperplate script for 4 decades does not suddenly resort to the impersonal clatter of a typewriter when bearing his soul. How very efficient. We called you, Eleanor said, stopping her pacing and looking directly at the older woman, because the local police are fools, and the estate is bleeding money, and we cannot find where he put it. The ledgers are a mess of missing pages and altered figures. We need someone who understands people, Miss Marple. We need someone to make sense of him, to find his hiding places. She walked to a side table and picked up a small, black, leather-bound book, holding it out as though it were something unpleasant and contagious. We found this in his quarters, under his mattress. His private diary. The police didn't even want it, said the typed confession was enough for the coroner. But it's full of numbers and names. Perhaps you can read it and find where he hid the money. Miss Marple took the book. It was heavy, the leather soft and worn from years of daily handling. She did not open it immediately. She knew, with the deep, unshakable instinct of a woman who had spent her life observing the darker currents of human nature, that Cornelius Whitmore had not stolen a single penny. A man who steals does not keep the keys to the safe, he throws them away and runs. I will read it, Miss Marple said quietly, placing the book in her knitting bag. And I will tell you exactly what he meant to say. Chapter 2, The Order of Things. To read Cornelius Whitmore's diary was to enter a cathedral built entirely of routine and devotion. Miss Marple sat up late in the guest bedroom that night, wrapped in a knitted shawl, the only sound the slow, measured ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the occasional rattle of autumn wind against the leaded windows, and began to turn the pages. The early entries, dated from the previous spring, were not the outpourings of a man's soul or the desperate calculations of a thief, but the meticulous, lovingly kept records of an estate's pulse. April 12. The new footman, James, requires further instruction on the polishing of the George III silver. He applies too much pressure to the hallmarks, risking their degradation. Lady Eleanor has requested the azaleas be moved to the south terrace, which will annoy the undergardener, but I shall manage his temper. Must remember to order the specific Darjeeling blend for Mr. Richard from Fortnum's, though he drinks it too quickly to appreciate the leaf. It was a world of rigid order, captured in a handwriting so precise it looked engraved by a jeweler. Miss Marple felt a pang of profound recognition. Whitmore was a man who believed that if the silver was polished, the tea ordered, and the schedules kept without fail, the chaos and tragedy of the outside world could be held safely at bay. He was a guardian. Through his eyes, the household of Ashgrove Hall began to take shape, far more clearly than if Miss Marple had interviewed them all. There was Lady Eleanor, commanding, distracted, and deeply reliant on the structure Whitmore provided. There was Richard, the heir, whose entries in the diary were always accompanied by small, polite, but damning notations of personal debt. May 4th settled Mr. Richard's tailoring bill in Savile Row. He requested the receipt not be passed to the main estate ledger, but paid from the household petty cash. I have noted the shortfall. There was the younger sister, Beatrice, who drifted through the great house in a cloud of expensive perfume and vague, perpetual discontent. June 1st, Miss Beatrice misplaced her pearl eardrop in the conservatory again. I found it beneath the orchids. She is careless with things she believes will always be replaced, failing to understand their intrinsic value. And then there was Mr. Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton was the family solicitor, a senior partner in the firm of Pendleton, Stokes and Croft, which had managed the Ashgrove legal and financial affairs since Queen Victoria's Jubilee. In person, as Miss Marple would later learn, Pendleton was a man of aggressive, overpowering joviality, red-faced and loud, who patted people heavily on the back and spoke of the estate as though he owned it himself. In Whitmore's diary, Pendleton appeared frequently, always with a note of subtle, professional friction, the quiet grinding of gears between a man who manages money and a man who manages the home. July 14th, Mr. Pendleton arrived for the quarterly review. He left muddy boots on the Axminster carpet in the hall. I had them removed and cleaned immediately. He requested the keys to the muniment room to review the deeds. I reminded him that by Sir Horace's long-standing instruction, the keys remain on my person at all times, and I must accompany him. He was displeased, but I did not yield. Miss Marple smiled in the quiet room. She could picture the scene perfectly. The loud, entitled solicitor, and the quiet, immovable butler standing his ground. It reminded her of the time the new, terribly modern bank manager in St. Mary Mead had tried to reorganize the seating chart at the church fete, only to be entirely defeated by Miss Weatherby's polite but absolute refusal to move her jam stall. Whitmore knew the house better than the family did. He knew where the money went, how the wine was consumed, how the fires were laid. He was the ledger made flesh. And a man like that, Miss Marple thought, turning another page and listening to the wind, does not simply wake up one morning and decide to dismantle the structure he has spent 40 years building. Chapter 3: A Small Discrepancy. The turning point in the diary came in late August, marked not by a dramatic proclamation of discovering a crime, but by a quiet, mathematical anomaly, recorded with the dispassionate precision of an accountant. August 22nd, the entry read: The accounts from the home farm have been returned by Mr. Pendleton's office. There is a discrepancy of £40. It is listed as at miscellaneous agricultural repairs. I have reviewed the farm manager's receipts and spoken to the foreman. There were no repairs in July. The tractors were idle, and the barns are sound. Miss Marple adjusted her reading glasses. £40 was a small sum for a massive estate like Ashgrove, the sort of thing a busy family might easily overlook as the cost of doing business. But to Cornelius Whitmore, a discrepancy of £40 in a ledger was like a single discordant, jarring note in a symphony. It could not be ignored. It demanded investigation. August 28, the diary continued. I spoke to Mr. Pendleton via telephone regarding the home farm accounts. He laughed loudly and said it was a rounding error, a minor administrative fee absorbed into the estate costs for drawing up new tenant contracts. He told me not to trouble myself with the complex mechanics of the law, and suggested I focus on the wine cellar inventory. I did not mention to him that rounding errors do not generate physical, itemized receipts in a double-entry ledger. The tone of the diary began to change subtly from this point forward. The entries about the silver and the tea did not stop. They were his duty, but they were joined by a quiet, growing undercurrent of intense vigilance. Whitmore had noticed a loose thread in the tapestry of the estate, and he was beginning to pull it, careful not to unravel the whole cloth prematurely. September 5. The timber sale from the Eastwoods was finalized today. Mr. Pendleton handled the contracts and the buyers. The sum deposited into the main estate account is £200 less than the agreed sale price quoted by the mill. When I inquired with the foreman, he confirmed the full amount was paid via draft directly to Pendleton's firm for processing and legal fees. £200 is an exorbitant fee for a standard timber contract. Miss Marple paused, letting the heavy diary rest on her lap. She knew exactly what was happening. It was the oldest trick in the world, the slow, parasitic bleed of an estate by a trusted advisor who knows that the family is too wealthy, too arrogant, and too distracted to check the arithmetic. It had happened to old Mrs. Carmichael in the village, whose charming nephew had slowly drained her savings by overcharging for necessary roof repairs that never seemed to actually happen. Whitmore, sitting in his small pantry with his fountain pen and his immaculate columns of numbers, was watching Ashgrove Hall being robbed blind by the man paid to protect it. September 14, Whitmore wrote, his handwriting as steady as ever, but the ink pressed slightly harder into the paper, leaving an indentation on the reverse side. I requested the full ledger from the firm for the past 5 years, citing Lady Eleanor's desire for a comprehensive budget review. Mr. Pendleton's clerk informed me that the ledgers are currently undergoing internal audit and cannot be released. I am the steward of this house. It is my solemn duty to ensure its foundations are secure. If they will not give me the records, I must find them myself. Tomorrow, I shall go into town. Chapter 4, The House Turns. The tragedy of Cornelius Whitmore was that he was simply too good at his job. He moved so silently, managed the house so seamlessly, that the family had long ago stopped seeing him as a person with agency. To them, he was part of the furniture. And when the furniture begins to ask questions, people become uncomfortable. By early October, the diary revealed a shift in the atmosphere of the house. Whitmore's quiet inquiries had not gone unnoticed, but instead of the family turning their scrutiny on the solicitor, they turned it on the butler. Miss Marple read the entries with a growing sense of dread, recognizing the grim inevitability of human nature. When faced with a choice between an uncomfortable truth and a comfortable lie, most people will wrap themselves in the lie and lock the door. October 3, Lady Eleanor summoned me to the morning room. She was displeased. Mr. Pendleton had informed her that I was harassing his clerks for financial records. She reminded me that my duties concern the household, not the estate management. I attempted to explain the discrepancies in the timber accounts, the missing £200 from the Eastwood sale. She raised her hand, the heavy sapphire on her ring finger catching the morning light, and told me I was overstepping my station. "Arthur has been our solicitor for 20 years, Whitmore," she said. Her tone was the one she usually reserved for a tradesman who had delivered the wrong grade of coal. "He was my husband's closest confidant. Do not make trouble where there is none. You are here to ensure the silver is polished and the staff are managed, not to play at being an accountant." Miss Marple sighed, a small, sad sound in the quiet bedroom. She knew the terrible power of established authority. A gentleman solicitor in a tailored suit will always be believed over a servant, no matter how loyal the servant has been. It is a matter of class, and comfort, and the desperate human desire not to have one's trust broken by a peer. Lady Eleanor could not accept that Pendleton was a thief, because that would mean acknowledging her own terrible judgment. It was far easier to believe that her aging butler was becoming eccentric and insubordinate. The diary grew darker, the entries shorter, the handwriting taking on a sharper, more staccato rhythm. Whitmore was becoming isolated in the house he ran. October 9th, Mr. Richard asked me for £50 in cash from the household safe. I requested a receipt for the ledger, as I always do. It is standard procedure. He became angry, his face flushing with the particular, petulant heat of a young man who knows he is in the wrong. He stated that he does not need to justify his expenses to the staff. "Pendleton says you're getting too big for your boots, Whitmore," he snapped, snatching the notes from the cash box. "Keep your nose in the pantry where it belongs, or we'll find someone who will." The family was closing ranks, guided by the subtle, poisonous whispers of Arthur Pendleton. The solicitor was building a wall between Whitmore and the Ashgroves, ensuring that when the time came, anything the butler said would be dismissed as the rambling of a disgruntled, overstepping servant. Pendleton was laying the groundwork for a counter-offensive, poisoning the well of family trust so completely that Whitmore would have no one to turn to. And then, the most chilling entry yet. October 15th. I found the door to my quarters unlocked this afternoon. Nothing appeared to be missing at first glance, but the arrangement of my desk had been altered. The household ledger was moved 2 inches to the left. The silver inkwell was turned slightly. Someone is looking for my records. Someone has been in my private sanctuary. I have taken to carrying this diary on my person at all times, tucked inside my waistcoat. They think I am a fool. They think because I serve the tea, I do not hear the conversation. I hear everything. I hear the changing tenor of their voices when Pendleton visits. I hear the quiet, panicked phone calls Mr. Richard makes to his tailors. The house is sick, and the doctor is the one administering the poison. Miss Marple closed the diary for a moment, resting her eyes. She looked out the window at the dark, sprawling grounds of Ashgrove Hall. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the estate looked vast and hostile. Cornelius Whitmore had not been a thief. He had been a watchman. And the watchman had realized, too late, that the wolves were already inside the house, and that he was the only one who could see them. Chapter 5: The Quiet Inquiry. Miss Marple awoke the next morning to the sound of rain against the glass, a steady, dreary drumming that seemed entirely appropriate for the atmosphere of Ashgrove Hall. She took breakfast in her room, preferring the quiet company of toast and tea to the brittle hostility that radiated from the family below. Lady Eleanor had been pacing the lower halls, and Richard was already nursing a drink. They were waiting for her to find the money they believed Whitmore had hidden. They were waiting for validation. She returned to the leather-bound diary, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the pages. The entries from late October showed Cornelius Whitmore stepping out of his role as the invisible steward and becoming, in his own precise, limited way, an investigator. He did not possess the dramatic flair of a detective in a novel, he possessed something far more dangerous. He possessed patience. And he possessed a profound, encyclopedic knowledge of how institutions functioned. October 18th, the diary read. It was my half-day today. I took the omnibus into town, wearing my tweed suit rather than my uniform. I visited the county records office under the pretense of confirming the boundaries of the South Paddock for a fencing dispute. The clerk was accommodating, if somewhat slow. I requested the public filings for Mr. Pendleton's firm, Pendleton, Stokes and Croft. Miss Marple nodded in approval. It was exactly what she would have done. The public records of a solicitor's firm, while carefully curated, often contained the shadows of their true financial movements if one knew how to look at the negative space. A smart thief does not put his theft on a billboard, he buries it in paperwork. I spent 3 hours reviewing the public trust declarations, Whitmore wrote. The print was very fine, and the legal jargon was dense, designed to obfuscate. But the numbers do not lie. Pendleton has been establishing a series of small, interlocking trusts over the past 5 years. They are entirely legal structures, but they are nested like Russian dolls. The primary beneficiaries are listed as estate maintenance subsidiaries. The addresses for these subsidiaries are not physical offices, they are post office boxes in London. Whitmore was moving carefully, quietly, gathering the threads without tugging on them hard enough to alert the spider in the center of the web. He understood that he was outmatched in terms of social standing and legal resources. His only advantage was surprise. October 22nd. I have begun matching the dates of the estate's largest outlays, the roof repairs that were never fully completed, the timber sales that seemed undervalued, the agricultural investments that yielded no visible return, against the dates of deposits into Pendleton's London subsidiaries. I used the old estate ledgers, the ones I am permitted to review for historical household budgeting. The correlation is exact. The dates match perfectly, allowing for a 3-day clearing period at the bank. He is not merely skimming, he is diverting entire channels of the estate's income into his own reservoirs, disguised as administrative necessities and third-party contractor fees. Miss Marple could almost see him, sitting at his small desk in the pantry late at night. The rest of the house would be asleep, the great clocks ticking in the silent halls. He would have a single lamp casting a circle of yellow light over the columns of figures, his fountain pen scratching quietly against the paper. He was building a wall of arithmetic, a fortress of undeniable fact, brick by brick. He was a man fighting for the honor of the house he had served for 4 decades. October 25th. I require physical proof. The ledgers alone are circumstantial without the corresponding transfer receipts. The public records show the existence of the trusts, but they do not prove that Ashgrove money went directly into them. The firm keeps copies of all transfer receipts in the black deed boxes in their secondary archive on High Street. I know this because I once delivered a box there myself, 10 years ago, on Sir Horace's orders. The archive is guarded only by a junior clerk and a very old lock. I must find a way to access that archive without Pendleton's knowledge. It was a staggering risk for a man who had lived his entire life by the rules. To contemplate breaking into a solicitor's archive, to cross the line from quiet inquiry into active espionage, it spoke of a desperation, a profound moral outrage, that only a man wholly devoted to the integrity of his house could feel. Whitmore was not trying to save his own skin, he was trying to save Ashgrove from a parasite that was slowly killing it from the inside. Chapter 6: The Broken Seal. The tragedy of an honest man attempting to outwit a dishonest one is that the honest man assumes the rules of logic still apply. He assumes that facts, once revealed, will act as a shield. He forgets that the dishonest man is not fighting with facts, he is fighting with narrative. And Arthur Pendleton was a master of narrative. The diary's entries in early November chronicled a sudden, devastating shift in the house's internal weather. It began, as these things often do, with something small, petty, and deliberately misplaced. November 2nd, Whitmore wrote, the handwriting showing the first faint signs of a physical tremor, the ink slightly heavier on the downstrokes. There is £50 missing from the household safe. I balanced the cash box this morning after paying the butcher, and the discrepancy was immediate. I hold the only key, save for the duplicate kept by Lady Eleanor in her bedroom suite. I informed her at once, expecting her to authorize a search of the staff quarters. She did not order a search. She looked at me with an expression I have never seen in her eyes before. It was not anger. It was a terrible, cold resignation. It was the look of a judge who has already passed sentence in her mind. "Are you quite sure, Whitmore?" she asked. Her voice was like ice. "Are you sure you haven't simply misplaced it?" Miss Marple knew that look. It was the look of a person who has finally been convinced of something they did not want to believe, but are now perversely relieved to have confirmed. Pendleton's poison had taken root. November 3rd, Mr. Pendleton arrived today. He did not ring ahead. He was closeted with Lady Eleanor and Mr. Richard in the morning room for 2 hours. I was not summoned to serve tea. Beatrice brought the tray herself, spilling a portion of it in the hallway. When Pendleton left, he did not look at me. He looked through me, as though I had already ceased to exist. The trap was closing. Pendleton, sensing that Whitmore was getting too close, perhaps alerted by a clerk at the records office, or perhaps simply recognizing the stubborn, unyielding nature of the butler, had not waited for Whitmore to strike. He had struck first. He had engineered a petty theft, a missing £50, not to enrich himself, but to create a precedent. To establish the narrative of the thieving servant. November 5th. The unthinkable has happened. The ground has opened up beneath my feet. Lady Eleanor summoned me to the library. Pendleton was present, standing by the fire. They informed me that a preliminary audit of the household accounts, conducted, conveniently, by Pendleton's own clerks, revealed systemic irregularities spanning the past 3 years. They accused me of inflating the tradesmen's bills. They accused me of pocketing the difference on the grocer's accounts, the butcher's accounts, the wine merchant's accounts. Pendleton produced a sheaf of doctored receipts from his briefcase. They were clever forgeries, utilizing my own signature. He must have traced it from years of old correspondence. The ink was slightly too blue, the pressure too uniform, but to an untrained eye, to Lady Eleanor's eye, they looked genuine. Miss Marple felt a cold anger rise in her chest. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. It was so simple, and so brutally effective. Paint the investigator as the criminal. Create a cloud of suspicion so thick, so choking, that any accusation the butler made against the solicitor would look like the desperate, retaliatory lies of a guilty man. Pendleton was using the family's own class prejudice against them, playing on their deep-seated fear of being cheated by the help. I denied it, of course. The diary continued, the words pressing hard into the paper. I stated that I could account for every penny, that I had the original receipts in my ledger. Lady Eleanor held up her hand. She said they would not involve the police immediately, in consideration of my long service to her late husband. She said I was suspended from my duties, effective immediately. I am confined to my quarters. They will conduct a full inventory of the silver, the cellars, and the artworks before deciding how to proceed. Pendleton smiled at me as I left the room. Just a small, terrible stretching of the lips. He knows I know. And he knows that the family will never believe a suspected thief over a trusted gentleman. I am trapped in the house I have spent my life protecting. Chapter 7. What the Solicitor Knew. Miss Marple closed the diary and stood up, walking to the large bay window that overlooked the rear gardens. The rain was easing, leaving the expansive grounds of Ashgrove Hall slick and grey, resembling a watercolor painting left out in a damp shed. She was standing in the middle of a battlefield where the war had already been lost, but the casualty had managed, with his dying breath, to draw a precise map of the enemy's positions. She returned to the heavy leather book, turning to the final pages. The handwriting was no longer the immaculate copperplate of the earlier months, it was hurried, urgent, the script of a man racing against a clock he could not see but could distinctly hear ticking. November 8th. Confined to quarters. The house feels utterly foreign to me now, like a garment I have worn for decades that suddenly does not fit. James, the footman I trained myself, brought my meals today and would not meet my eyes. He placed the tray on the edge of the desk as though it might contaminate him. They truly believe I am a thief. 40 years of service, of waking before dawn to ensure the fires were lit, of knowing exactly how Lady Eleanor preferred her tea and how Sir Horace liked his collars starched, erased in a single afternoon by a man with a clever smile and a briefcase full of lies. But I am not defeated. Pendleton's arrogance is his vulnerability. He assumed that by confining me to my room, by stripping me of my keys and my authority, he had neutralized me. He forgot that a butler does not need to leave the house to communicate with the outside world. He is the hub of the wheel. He forgot the telephone in the pantry. Miss Marple smiled, a small, approving curve of the lips. A man who runs a house knows how to use its veins and arteries. Pendleton had focused on the ledgers, forgetting the logistical network that made the house function. November 10th. I waited until the house was entirely asleep last night. I slipped down the back stairs. The floorboards creak on the fourth step from the bottom, a fact I have known since 1922. I stepped over it. I used the pantry telephone to contact an old acquaintance, a Mr. Higgins, who was once the head clerk at Pendleton's firm before being unceremoniously retired without a pension. Higgins has no love for Pendleton, having been discarded when he became too old to be useful, much as I am being discarded now. For a modest sum, drawn from my own savings, the money I had set aside for a quiet retirement in Cornwall, he agreed to visit the secondary archive on High Street. The diary entries here became disjointed, recorded at odd hours, tracking the slow, agonizing wait for the return of the scout. It was a testament to Whitmore's endurance that he did not break during this period of forced inaction. November 13th. Higgins has delivered. He is a marvel of the old clerical school. He sent a package to the tradesman's entrance, marked as laundry for the staff. The new footman brought it up without a second glance. Inside the parcel are copies of the transfer receipts from the past 5 years. The proof is absolute. It is overwhelming. Pendleton's signature is on every authorization, routing the estate's funds into the dummy trusts. I have spent the day compiling the dossier. The cross-references are complete. The arithmetic is unassailable. I have matched every inflated bill, every phantom repair, to a specific transfer receipt signed by Arthur Pendleton. Even Lady Eleanor, blinded by class and habit, will not be able to deny the evidence of her own bank stamps. She will have to look at the truth. The next entry was the penultimate one in the book. November 15th. I have requested a formal audience with the family tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I told Lady Eleanor I intend to make a full statement regarding the missing funds. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. She assumed I meant a confession. I did not correct her. Let them assemble. Let Pendleton be present. I will present the dossier and let the paper speak for itself. I have hidden the dossier. It is not in my quarters. Pendleton's reach is long, and I do not trust the integrity of my own locked doors. I know he has ways of walking through this house unseen. I have placed it where only I would look, and where no gentleman would ever think to search. Miss Marple tapped her finger against the page, her mind turning over the possibilities. Where no gentleman would ever think to search. It was a clue, left deliberately, just in case he did not make it to the morning room. Chapter 8, A Death Among the Bottles. The final entry in Cornelius Whitmore's diary was written on the evening of November 15th, just hours before he died. The ink was dark, the pressure uneven, reflecting a man standing on the precipice of a momentous revelation. 10 p.m. The house is quiet. The audience is set for tomorrow. I feel a strange calm settling over me. For 40 years, I have maintained the order of this house by polishing the silver, managing the staff, and ensuring the clocks kept the correct time. Tomorrow, I will maintain it by excising a rot that threatens to collapse the entire structure. I will do my final duty. There is a noise on the stairs leading down to the kitchen passage. Footsteps. Too heavy for the maids, who wear soft-soled shoes. Too measured and deliberate for Mr. Richard, who always takes the stairs 2 at a time. Someone is walking the house. Someone who does not belong here. I must ensure the dossier is secure. If they find it before the morning, all is lost. I will go down to the cellars. And that was it. The ink trailed off, the final letter S carrying a slight smear, as though the book had been closed hurriedly, slipped into a pocket as the writer rose to meet his fate. Miss Marple knew what had happened next. The police had reconstructed the physical events, even if they had entirely misunderstood the narrative. Whitmore had left his room. He had descended to the main floor, avoiding the creaking floorboards with the muscle memory of 40 years, and then taken the steep, narrow wooden stairs down to the wine cellar. He had been found at the bottom the next morning, his neck broken. The police, arriving in the cold light of day, noted that the cellar door at the top of the stairs had been open, the light switch untouched. They noted the smell of brandy on his clothes, a sharp, alcoholic tang that masked the smell of damp stone. They noted the shattered bottle of vintage Armagnac, a bottle Whitmore would never have opened without authorization, lying near his outstretched hand. And, most damningly, they noted the typed confession, found neatly aligned on his small desk upstairs, illuminated by a single lamp. It read, "I cannot bear the shame of what I have done. The estate accounts are my doing. I have betrayed the family I served." It was a perfectly staged tableau. It was the picture of a guilty, despairing servant who had sought liquid courage, written his final apologies, and met a clumsy, tragic end in the dark. The police inspector had taken one look, closed his notebook, and ruled it an accidental death preceded by embezzlement. But Miss Marple, turning the pages of the diary, knew the terrible truth. Whitmore had gone down to the cellars to check on his hidden dossier. He had been followed. The footsteps he had heard belonged to Arthur Pendleton, who had somehow learned of the impending statement, perhaps from Lady Eleanor herself, who trusted him completely, and had come to the house, letting himself in with the familiarity of a trusted friend, to ensure that the statement was never made. Pendleton had confronted Whitmore at the top of the stairs. There had perhaps been a struggle in the dark, or perhaps just a sudden, violent shove. Whitmore, an elderly man taken by surprise, had fallen. Pendleton, breathing heavily, listening to the silence that followed the crash, had descended the stairs. He had poured the brandy over the dying man to sell the story of drunkenness, smashed the bottle to complete the picture, and then gone upstairs to the pantry typewriter to forge the confession. It was brutal, efficient, and entirely successful. A masterclass in misdirection. Miss Marple closed the diary. The past was clear. The dead man had spoken from beyond the grave, his voice captured in ink and paper. But the dossier, the physical proof that would expose Pendleton, clear Whitmore's name, and return the stolen funds to the estate, was still hidden. Where no gentleman would ever think to search. Miss Marple stood up, smoothing the skirt of her sensible tweed suit. It was time, she decided, to stop reading history and start making it. She left the guest bedroom and walked out into the corridor, her steps silent on the thick carpet, moving toward the stairs with the determination of a woman who knows exactly what she is looking for. Chapter 9: The Missing Entry. The great house of Ashgrove Hall was profoundly quiet when Miss Marple descended the main staircase, the thick Persian carpets absorbing the sound of her practical, low-heeled shoes. She was not a woman given to midnight excursions or amateur dramatics, but the urgency of the dead man's final entry compelled her. She needed to find the dossier before Arthur Pendleton realized it still existed. Where no gentleman would ever think to search. She walked through the silent hall, past the closed doors of the morning room and the library, where the family's portraits looked down with aristocratic indifference. She pushed through the green baize door that separated the family's world of silk and mahogany from the servants' quarters. The air here was cooler, smelling faintly of carbolic soap, cold ash, and polished brass. Miss Marple thought deeply about the phrase. A gentleman, a man like Arthur Pendleton, or Richard Ashgrove, thought in terms of locked drawers, hollowed-out books, secret compartments in writing desks, and wall safes hidden behind oil paintings. They thought of hiding places that required a key, a combination, or a clever mechanism. They did not think of the mundane, the laborious, the places where physical work was actually done. They did not see the architecture of labor. She walked past the pantry, where the typewriter still sat on the desk, past the cavernous kitchen with its great cast-iron stoves, and stopped before the heavy oak door that led to the cellars. She opened it and switched on the light. The steep wooden stairs stretched down into the gloom, the air growing noticeably colder. At the bottom, a faint chalk outline, drawn by the police and inadequately scrubbed by the Daily Woman, still marked the spot where Cornelius Whitmore had fallen. She descended slowly, holding the handrail tightly, acutely aware of how easy it would be to fall in the dark. The wine cellar was vast, a subterranean labyrinth of arched brick and dusty bottles stretching back into the shadows. The racks held thousands of bottles, some dating back a century. Whitmore had come down here to check on the dossier. That meant it was hidden here. But where? A gentleman would look behind the expensive vintages, checking for false backing in the racks, or tap the brickwork for hollow sounds. He might look inside an empty crate of champagne. Miss Marple, however, thought like a woman who had spent 40 years observing the practicalities of domestic life, a woman who knew how a house was cleaned and maintained. She walked past the racks of claret and burgundy, ignoring the expensive dust, moving toward the far end of the cellar, where the air grew damp and the floor was rougher, unfinished stone. Here, pushed against the back wall, near the grating that led to the outside, was the household coal chute. And beside it a large, heavy wooden bin used for storing the rough sand used to sweep and scrub the stone floors. It was a filthy, heavy, utterly unglamorous object, battered from years of use. A gentleman would never touch it, for fear of soiling his cuffs or dirtying his hands. It was invisible to them. Miss Marple approached the bin. She lifted the heavy wooden lid, her arms straining slightly against the weight, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the sand was grey, cold, and slightly damp. She rolled up the sleeve of her cardigan, took a deep breath, and drove her hand deep into the grit, feeling around the edges and along the bottom. Near the back corner, beneath 6 inches of packed sand, her fingers brushed against something smooth and distinctly non-mineral. It was wrapped in thick, waterproof oilcloth. She dug it out, pulling it to the surface and shaking off the loose sand. It was a flat parcel, roughly the size of a ledger, tied securely with heavy twine. She untied the knot with quick, precise movements and peeled back the stiff cloth. Inside was a manila folder, thick with documents. On the front, in Cornelius Whitmore's unmistakable, immaculate copperplate script, were the words, "The Ashgrove Estate, a ledger of diverted funds. Prepared by Seal Whitmore." Miss Marple opened the folder. The first page was a meticulously hand-drawn summary sheet, cross-referencing the estate's major withdrawals with deposits into Arthur Pendleton's dummy trusts. The subsequent pages were the transfer receipts themselves, obtained by the faithful Mr. Higgins, each one bearing the solicitor's authorizing signature and the bank's official stamps. It was not just proof, it was an execution block, carefully constructed and waiting for the axe to fall. She wrapped the dossier back in the oilcloth, tucked it firmly under her arm, and began the slow climb back up the stairs. The watchman had done his job. Now, it was time to wake the house and balance the ledger. Chapter 10. The Ledger Balanced. The confrontation took place the following afternoon, in the library, a room dominated by dark mahogany paneling, towering bookshelves, and the imposing, gilded portraits of long-dead Ashgroves who seemed to pass judgment on everything below them. Lady Eleanor sat by the fire, smoking a cigarette in short, nervous puffs, the smoke curling around her rigid posture. Richard leaned against the mantelpiece, swirling a glass of sherry, his face flushed with the afternoon's drinking. Arthur Pendleton sat in a wing-back chair, his legs crossed, projecting an aura of bored, professional patience. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, an expensive watch, and the faint, condescending smile of a man who believes he holds all the cards. Miss Marple sat in her usual chintz chair, positioned slightly outside their circle, her knitting bag resting by her sensible shoes. She had requested the meeting shortly after luncheon, stating only that she had concluded her reading of the diary and had found something the family urgently needed to see. "Well, Miss Marple," Pendleton said, checking his pocket watch with a theatrical sigh. "We are all very busy people. The estate has many pressing matters. I assume you have failed to locate the money the butler stole. It is a pity, but entirely expected, as I warned Lady Eleanor. The man was a thorough criminal. They often hide their spoils too well for amateurs to find." Miss Marple looked at him. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Cornelius Whitmore never stole a single penny from this house, Mr. Pendleton. And you know it perfectly well, because the person who has been draining the Ashgrove accounts for the past 5 years is sitting in that chair. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy and sudden, like a dropped stone. Richard stopped swirling his sherry. Lady Eleanor's cigarette paused halfway to her mouth. The fire crackled in the grate, suddenly very loud. Pendleton let out a short, incredulous laugh, a practiced sound meant to convey amusement at absurdity. "My dear woman," he said, shaking his head. "Have you taken leave of your senses? I am the family solicitor. I have managed these accounts for 2 decades. My father managed them before me. To accuse me of... And you managed them very creatively, indeed," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice mild but possessing a core of iron. She reached down into her capacious knitting bag and withdrew the thick manila folder wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped it and placed it on the low table between them. "I found this in the cellars last night. Hidden deep in the sand bin near the coal chute. It is a comprehensive dossier, compiled by Mr. Whitmore over the last 3 months of his life." She opened the folder and placed the hand-drawn summary sheet on the top. It details the systematic diversion of estate funds into a series of interlocking trusts based in London. The beneficiaries are listed as estate maintenance subsidiaries. The authorized signatory on every transfer receipt is Arthur Pendleton. Richard stepped forward, his indolence vanishing, his face pale. He snatched the paper from the table and read it, his eyes moving rapidly down the columns of numbers. He looked at the bank routing numbers, the dates, the matching amounts. "These are forgeries," Pendleton said smoothly, though a faint, betraying sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead. "The desperate fabrications of a guilty servant trying to shift the blame. He was trying to frame me to save himself. It's pathetic." "Mr. Whitmore anticipated you might say exactly that," Miss Marple replied, unfazed. "He knew you would attack his credibility. Which is why he arranged for his associate, Mr. Higgins, to obtain the original carbon copies of the transfer receipts from your own secondary archive on High Street. They are in the folder, Mr. Pendleton. Complete with your firm's watermarks and the bank's official stamps. They are not copies he drew. They are the documents you signed." Lady Eleanor stood up. She looked at the folder, then at Pendleton, and the awful, dawning realization of betrayal settled over her aristocratic features, hardening them into a mask of fury. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Is this true? Have you been stealing from us? All these years, while you drank my husband's wine and told us you were protecting the estate?" Pendleton stood up, his face flushed darkly, the jovial mask slipping entirely to reveal the snarling desperation beneath. "You believe this? You believe the scribblings of a dead servant over a man of my standing? The man was a thief and a drunkard. He confessed. You saw the letter yourself, Eleanor. He admitted it." "He did not confess," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through his panic like a silver blade. "And he did not fall down those stairs by accident." Chapter 11: The Fall Undone. Miss Marple stood up. She was a frail, elderly woman in a shapeless cardigan, but in that moment, she commanded the room entirely. The Ashgroves looked at her, captivated by the terrifying clarity of her logic. "The typed confession found on his desk," she said, looking directly into Pendleton's eyes. "You wrote it, didn't you? You came to the house on the night of November 15th. You knew Whitmore was preparing to make a formal statement to the family the next morning. You couldn't allow that. You found him at the top of the cellar stairs, going down to check on this very dossier." "This is slander," Pendleton spat, taking a step toward the door. "I won't listen to the fantasies of an old woman. I will sue you for every penny you possess." "The diary ends abruptly at 10 o'clock, Miss Marple continued, relentless, ignoring his threat. He heard footsteps. Heavy, measured footsteps. He went down to check the hidden dossier. You followed him. You pushed him down the stairs in the dark. And then you poured brandy over him and typed that pathetic, cowardly note. But you made one crucial mistake, Mr. Pendleton. A mistake born of panic and arrogance." Pendleton stopped. He could not help himself. The instinct of the guilty is always to know exactly how they were caught. "What mistake?" "You assume that a man who has written in a precise, copperplate hand for 40 years, a man who prided himself on his penmanship and his formal propriety, would suddenly use a typewriter for his most profound, agonizing communication. But Cornelius Whitmore was a man of the old school. If he had truly meant to confess, if he had truly felt the shame you ascribed to him, he would have done it in ink. He would have written it out carefully, and he would have signed his name. The typewriter was the tool of a man who needed to hide his own handwriting. It was the tool of a solicitor used to drafting sterile documents, not a butler bearing his soul. Richard moved, suddenly and violently, blocking the library door. The sherry glass shattered against the hearthstone, the amber liquid soaking into the rug. "You killed him," Richard said, his voice shaking with a rage that finally stripped away his indolence and revealed the Ashgrove temper beneath. "You stole from us, and when he found out, when he tried to warn us, you killed him in our own house, and you let us believe he was the thief." Pendleton looked at Richard, tall and furious, blocking his exit. He looked at Lady Eleanor, whose eyes were filled with disgust. And finally, he looked at Miss Marple, who stood quietly by her chair, the embodiment of inexorable truth. He saw the carbon receipt on the table. He saw the ruin of his reputation, his career, his life, laid out in neat, undeniable columns. He sagged, the fight draining out of him, leaving him looking suddenly old, small, and utterly hollow. He did not confess. He did not need to. The truth was written in the slump of his shoulders, the trembling of his hands, and the terrified darting of his eyes. "Call the police, Richard," Lady Eleanor said. Her voice was cold, harder than Miss Marple had ever heard it, harder than the limestone of the house itself. "Tell them to send the chief inspector. Tell them we have found the thief who has been robbing this estate for years. And the murderer who killed our butler." Chapter 12: The Unheard Voice. In the weeks that followed, the story of Ashgrove Hall unspooled in the local press and the national papers, a scandal that rocked the county and fascinated the public. Arthur Pendleton was arrested, charged with grand embezzlement and the premeditated murder of Cornelius Whitmore. The complex web of dummy trusts was dismantled by forensic accountants, and the stolen funds were slowly, painstakingly repatriated to the estate. The family, shattered by the profound betrayal of their trusted advisor and humiliated by their own complicity in doubting the man who had protected them, attempted to make amends. They commissioned a new, grand headstone for Cornelius Whitmore in the village churchyard, paying for it from the first wave of recovered funds. It was carved from the finest granite, bearing his name, his years of service, and a Latin inscription praising his unyielding loyalty. But Miss Marple knew that a headstone, however grand and expensive, could not undo the silence of a life spent unheard. It could not erase the fact that when he had tried to speak, they had shut him in his room. She stood by the grave on a crisp, bright December morning, her breath pluming in the cold air, before returning to St. Mary Mead. The air was sharp, the ground hard with white frost, the yew trees standing like silent sentinels. She held the small, leather-bound diary in her gloved hands, feeling the weight of the life contained within it. The family had asked for the diary back. Lady Eleanor had requested it formally, perhaps to read it and understand the depth of her butler's devotion, or perhaps, Miss Marple suspected, to burn it and erase the memory of their own failures and their own cruelty. Miss Marple had politely but firmly declined, stating that as the investigator, she was required to retain it for her personal records, and that Mr. Whitmore would have wanted it kept safe from those who had doubted him. She had no intention of ever giving it back to the house that had turned on him. Cornelius Whitmore had lived a life of quiet, invisible service. He had noticed everything, recorded everything, and said nothing, until the moment it truly mattered. And even then, his physical voice had been stolen from him by a murderer's hands. The diary was not just a ledger of accounts or a record of polishing silver, it was the ledger of a man's soul, the only place where he had been allowed to speak the truth without interruption, without being told to remember his place. "You were a good steward, Mr. Whitmore," Miss Marple said softly to the cold stone, placing a single white rose at its base. "You kept the house in order, even when the house did not deserve you. And the ledger is balanced at last." She placed the diary carefully in her bag, pulled her thick woolen coat tighter against the biting wind, and walked away down the gravel path, leaving the quietest man in Ashgrove Hall to his final, unshakable rest. And that, my friends, is the story of the butler's ledger. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That the people we look past every day, the people who pour our coffee or clean our floors or manage our routines, might be the only ones truly keeping the roof over our heads. We see them as furniture, but they see everything. Cornelius Whitmore might not have been a detective by trade, but he had the one trait every truly great investigator needs: he knew how to pay attention, and he knew how to keep a record. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please leave a comment down below. Tell me what you think of Arthur Pendleton's little typing mistake, or just say hello from wherever you're listening. Do you think you would have noticed the discrepancy in the accounts? Let me know. Don't forget to hit the like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Midnight Pages so you never miss a mystery. We have a lot more stories to tell, and a lot more pages to turn. Until next time, keep your doors locked, watch the quiet ones, and I'll see you in the next video. Good night.